Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone joining us today, and welcome to our third IIASA Public Webinar. This is our third event in a series that brings the fantastic work IIASA has to offer to a public audience. IIASA conducts policy-oriented research into problems that are too large or too complex to be solved by a single country or academic discipline. So our researchers are using applied systems thinking to tackle the challenges facing our society, such as climate change, sustainability, and demographic modeling, just to name a few. They partner with other scientists, governments, and local entities to create a broad understanding of problems that concern us all. They deliver important scientific information that is then used at different levels of government to make decisions on the future of our society. We believe that this information should be available to all, and we are also interested in new perspectives, which is why we've launched this series. It's a conversation with IIASA experts, which begins with a presentation and is then opened up for a Q&A. Today, we're joined by Reinhard Mechler, who has over 20 years of experience in analyzing and addressing socioeconomic aspects of disaster and climate change risks. His interest is to provide evidence-based advice to a wide range of public and private sector decision makers to improve decisions and build resilience against salient risks. He has led and contributed to many international research and consultancy projects. To cite a few, he is currently leading research for the Flood Resilient Alliance. He's acted as lead author of the IPCC Special Report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation, the fifth assessment report, and the report on 1.5 global warming, and is currently a lead author on the IPCC sixth assessment report. At IIASA, he's the leader of the Systemic Risk and Resilience Research Group. Reinhard will talk to us today about how to deal with climate-related existential risks and his insights after taking part in COP26. And with that, Reinhard, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Monica, for the kind introduction, and excited to give the third seminar, IIASA Public Webinar talk. Indeed, the topic is existential risk, so it's a somber topic, and I will be talking about climate change, but I'll try to make it relevant and salient, and during this complicated, still corona-stricken times. I have quite a few slides that I would like to present, and I hope for good Q&A afterwards. Existential risk is, all over the place. And it has also it's also being discussed in climate change, in the climate change field, and in responses taken to climate change. It's being discussed by Greta Thunberg, that is one of the figureheads of the climate activist movements. It's also as you see in Glasgow, it popped up with regard to our children's future. The UN General Secretary keeps talking about that the future of mankind, or humankind, is at stake. And also Joe Biden mentions it when he talks about climate change. So indeed, it's a big topic. What is it? This is more like a conversation here. So I would suggest to suffice, to use an ad hoc definition. I would say existential climate-related risks are linked to the chance of events happening that may compromise key objectives. I'll come to that, what it more concretely would mean. I'll present a bit of insight, what it means, and what can be done about it would be the second part. So that's the risk management adaptation limits part. I'll try to take that complicated topic into the policy dialogue on loss and damage. So that's something that has been discussed at COP26, at the 26th Global Climate Summit, where I will also present some takeaways later on. And then I end with some maybe a bit more upbeat messages of what can we do about it. Existential risk, what is it? I talked about these objectives, and here you see some of those mentioned. A key objective of all of us is, of course, physical survival. Then it's basic needs, shelter and food, and also of course, interactions, connections, and then well-being more broadly. In this chart, you see that there's a number of threats or risks that impact on these objectives. And indeed, climate change may go all the way, and that's what I'll try to show. in the next few minutes that I'll be presenting. Existential risk has been looked at in climate change work, for example, as done by the IPCC. It's also being looked at, of course, as part of the COVID-19 pandemic and responses to that. The climate movement talks a lot about existential risk, and then the global catastrophic risks are also tackling those existential risk. This busy chart here is only suggestive to say that, the glass is half full. A bit more can be done to inform the action and responses on existential risk in the climate space. Indeed, existential risk has been looked at, or it has been framed as dangerous. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one or two decades back, created the reasons for concern, the RFCs, that looked into 5 systems and how risk levels in those systems would, over time, proliferate. For example, here, RFC 1 is unique and threatened systems. That could be the West Antarctic ice shield disintegrating, or like it could be like the coral reefs, losing the coral reefs. And you see how risks would proliferate or would develop over time with levels of warming from 1 degree to 1.5 to 2 degrees. And here's 5 systems. 2 of those are more natural systems, and 3 of those are more social systems. I would talk about the social systems and what do we know here and what additionally has to be known. Colleagues from the IPCC and policymakers would argue that this emblematic representation of key risk has been informing action on climate change. For example, at COP16, this is 10 years back, on the 2-degree target, and then 6 years back at COP21 in Paris, that was upgraded to 1.5 degrees. And that's indeed the global ambition. So keeping global warming due to anthropogenic climate change to only 1.5 degrees. Global warming currently is 1.1. So we're getting close. So what can we do about this? I'll talk about this a bit later. Let me just quickly talk about risks or tipping points in natural physical systems. This has been well studied over the years, also by colleagues at IIASA, at my institution. So there's the West Antarctic ice sheet that I mentioned, the Atlantic circulation that has slowed down already, and that may further slow down with climate change proceeding. So there's good information here, and it has raised the alarm. Also in social systems, we're seeing it happening, right? 21 was a year when we saw massive wildfires, we saw massive flooding in the Himalayas. That's Germany here, is also affected by a really big flood event, and heat has also been proliferating. So indeed, impacts and events are with us, and there's a climate signal in those. And so also in social systems, we are seeing those impacts and risks proceeding, and further attention needs to be paid to those. If you look into unnatural disasters, so like extreme events, extreme hazards that lead to events, you see also the numbers of those events rising, and losses with great volatility are also on the increase. It's important to understand here, it's climate pushing that, but it's also natural variability that we have. Then it's vulnerability and exposure that lead to like a certain level of risk. So there's multiple drivers behind it. Climate change has been indeed understood to be also has become a key driver behind it. Understanding risk helps to think about risk management and adaptation actions, but there's also adaptation limits that need to be understood. How have those been analyzed? So that's a key focus of my presentation. There is global insight produced by the global and regional level oriented IPCC reports. It's quite often climate scenario driven, so it starts with climate change, ends with risk. It's over long time horizons that these studies go. There's also work that starts at the scale of risk management that can be a household, a community, that's more risk driven and looks into the current time period. It's often also using case study explorations, so-called impact chains. So how is risk cascading across systems, within systems and across systems? Household surveys are being used, and also expert judgment needs to be put into that mix. So these are 2 different, as we call it, lines of evidence that can be taken forward. I think both are important, and we need to take both forward to better understand existential risk and also those limits to adaptation that I would talk about a little bit. Here, a little insight from the seminal 1.5 report that indeed asked the question, can we still reach 1.5 degrees of global warming, and what happens thereafter? And the message has been also quite somber and bleak. For example, in agriculture and food security, we see like the additional people affected by reduced yields due to climate change. Those numbers may increase by tenfold if we go to 2 degrees of warming. There's adaptation possible with climate-resistant varieties in irrigation. Adaptation potential can be higher in high latitudes, but it can also be low in low latitudes and also generally operates at medium levels. So adaptation is possible, but not perfectly so. If you look into another system like water resources, here the message is many more people water stressed at 1.5 and 2 degrees. The adaptation potential very limited. So that takes us quite into that limit space. Adaptation not being possible at a certain level of warming. Let me just jump to the next slide that tries to exactly frame this busy chart more as this question about adaptation limits. Is there a hard limit where no adaptation will be feasible? Or is there a soft limit where over time additional actions can be taken before a hard limit is being reached? There's really good evidence that was, well, there's solid evidence that was also produced in this 1.5 report that very, very unfortunately will be losing tropical coral reefs at 2 degrees of warming. So 99% of those coral reefs, these precious ecosystems, the biggest ecosystem in the world, will be lost for good. So irreversible change. Also biodiversity, we see also like big impacts proliferating with increasing warming. So we see some hard limits, and here the confidence level, as IPCC types try to refer to, are quite solid. In social systems, the level of confidence is not that broad, but we also have good information on soft limits, for example, with regard to poverty or human health, where many more people will face deadly heatwave conditions by 2050 across the globe. And there's also messaging that some small islands may be lost due to increasing sea level rise, worsening flooding due to cyclones, and also heat and drought impacting some of these atoll islands, as they're mentioned here. So these are tough messages coming from the IPCC, from global or regional insight. A key question, if you want to further think about what will happen, but what also can be done about it, is like what happens at more local level, at community levels. So this is the second line of evidence I wanted to present. How to think about current risk and how would they develop over time. And we have done some work in Tamil Nadu, in southeastern India, with looking into smallholder farmers, how their subsistence coming from crops from rice or paddy fields, how are they being impacted by climate change. Here, the logic is a bit different. You start to think about the key hazards those communities are faced with. Then what does this lead to in terms of impacts? How do risks compare, like from those hazards to other risks, like health issues or price shocks? And what actions do people take and can take? So that's really this logic of co-generation, checking in, doing surveys, running focus groups locally to really understand what's currently at stake and what can currently be done about it. Busy slide here is bringing the risk perspective into place. We see hazards here, vulnerability there, exposure, intermediate impacts leading to an estimate of risk, which I'm not presenting here, but we are taking this visually into the risk management space. So what can farmers do at different levels of risks that are driven by climate change and other factors? And we call these risk layers. There's a certain risk layer where standard approaches like desalinizing the land or like building a sea dike, these communities are located close to sea, can push out saline water and can help with like keeping farmers going in that certain space. With higher levels of warming, that's not feasible anymore. If really groundwater pushes in, you need salt-tolerant, high-yielding seeds. And over time, farming becomes very hard and may actually push farmers beyond their limits, their hard limits. It really may lead to them needing to leave and doing something else if an event happens. Such unfortunate outcomes can be managed if livelihood transformation is being taken forward in this, as we call it, intolerable risk space. if, for example, farmers are offered means to diversify their livelihoods, they may pick up also work in close by cities and so on, so that they have a broadened subsistence base. Then we call it, this is like deliberate livelihood transformation can be taken forward. So that pushes the soft limits out, unfortunately only as so far, until like risks increasing again and really making agriculture infeasible. Sounds like a distant story, but of course it's something that's also seeing attention in India and other places. So it's also becoming reality. It is climate change, but also other factors behind it. So that's a different approach here. And it's about storylines, interacting with people and finding out what are their opportunities and threats that they're faced with today and what will climate change bring about. We've looked into other limit-prone locations globally. It's not that we're facing doomsday all over the globe, but certainly there's certain spots that need more attention. So small islands, the Arctic, Latin America, and yeah, Asia also, and some other spots. So that's a bit like unhappy messaging. Something can be done to push even beyond the soft limits, but then also some hard limits may be found for certain systems and populations and communities across the globe. More evidence needs to be generated, but the evidence that has been reported may be considered for like different purposes, including for policies, international policy that may support those that are living at the front lines of climate change. And there's international policy dialogue on loss and damage, and that's being negotiated and acted upon at the climate summits. So I wanted to jump into that here, into the policy space. What can be done about this, and what is this loss and damage policy dialogue about? It has been ongoing for 3 decades. It was started by the Alliance of Small Island States in 1991, that already then were saying, well, we are facing high-level sea level rise. We need action on that. And basically we need insurance, they were saying, but what they meant was compensation. We need compensation because we are facing the losses and damages already now. So that has been ongoing for quite a while, but has been an increasing groundswell over the years, but it took more than 20 years till the climate negotiations institutionalized dialogue on this topic of impacts that cannot be adapted to under the heading of the Warsaw Loss and Damage Mechanism, and that you see here in 2013. Paris also saw like a standalone article on loss and damage in 2015. And now 2 years back in Madrid, further discussion was had, and just in Glasgow, the finance question, as you see in that picture here, was moved into the foreground, was quite a hot topic. What is being discussed? Basically, it's a bit like global South versus global North, if I can put it simply. The global South indeed is demanding some sort of compensation for what has been lost. The global North suggests we can offer support and funding for insurance that may manage future risks. The dialogue is more complicated, but this is like maybe like two lines of discussion, like colliding. It's a little bit like this, I would say, the dialogue. It is about limits to adaptation, it's about existential risk, and it's about risk management also. That may include transformation. And that brings in the entry point of the work we are doing at IIASA. So how can risk management connect across these different perceptions and perspectives that are really clashing and colliding? Can there be a science-led solution somehow in that complex and contested space? And we would say yes, but with a big but, I would say. What is it about? Maybe you can put it like this. If you look into total disaster risk today and in the past and today, we see risks are increasing, and there's one part of risk of losses and damage that is not avoided, and one part that is anthropogenic, that is driven by anthropogenic climate change. So that's of course stylized. The loss and damage debate, capitalized loss and damage debate, is about small letter losses and damages after adaptation. So after adaptation or risk management, and indeed it's about the unavoided part. So what has not been avoided due to constraints like finance or governance, but what cannot be avoided, what has become unavoidable. So it's the hard and the soft limits that I mentioned earlier on. So that's how we would frame it: unavoided and unavoidable risks are at the heart of the loss and damage debate. That's our take on it. There's different takes on it. What we are proposing is quite simply to build on like how risks are generally being managed in Austria, Germany, but also like in India and other places. One could call this a risk layering framework being taken forward. It's operating again with this logic of risk. So we see risk here from low to high, and from risk as like a theoretical construct. Risk is always a construct, right? Before it becomes real, it's just in our heads. When it becomes real, it's an impact. The part of the risk that cannot be reduced is then the residual risk. So that's a part where it doesn't make sense to build the flood barriers 20 meters high, or for example, where insurance may not work anymore, where maybe not cost efficient. Residual risks sound small, but those residual risks are quite massive in many places across the globe. And here comes in the avoided, unavoided, and unavoidable logic. So if risk is avoided, it's not there. If it's unavoided, it's residual risk. And part of this residual risk is unavoidable. So that may be a bit theoretical, but idea is then what to do about it. It's indeed for those risks that happen frequently, maybe lower impact, we do risk reduction, prevention preparedness. That makes sense up to a certain level of events. Like we talk lots about this 100 or 200 year events. Generally, like in Austria, Germany, flood barriers are built to 50 or 100 years levels. They're not built to 1,000 year levels. So they don't prepare you for the 1 in 1,000 year. It's only the Netherlands that has taken up that, because that costs a lot fortune, and that's we don't see all over the globe. What's then been taken up after certain like physical risk reduction measures are taken is insurance, right? So that's finance that helps to deal with the unavoided, the residual risk. Prepayment before something happens gives you a payout after an event. So that's commonly taken forward, but in most places in the world, it's not only private sector organized, also the public sector plays a key role. There's limits to that. It's not endlessly available. It's really costly. It also costs. So people there's always like, there's nowhere in the world there's zero risk. There's always a sizable residual risk. The question then remains, what's this risk retention layer? So where we may see some impacts affecting us, so like really unhappy impacts if you're not able to bear the risk. So forced displacement or migration or loss of livelihoods may be a consequence. So that's more a standard way to think about this. What has come in recently is also this issue of transformation. So if on-site risk reduction management is not possible anymore, communities and societies across the globe or cities have been also taking action like managed retreat, where whole cities are being moved in the UK or in Indonesia that are faced with like increasing levels of flooding. We would call this transformational risk management because it's not the standard actions that are being taken. So let's sound theoretical again, but let's, okay, and here you see also our proposal. So the disaster risk reduction actions and climate adaptation actions that are taken forward all over the globe well cover that part here. What's not so well covered is this higher layer of risk, which we think at IIASA and also working with researchers globally that loss and damage can take action on. And that's a bit the suggestion what finance, because finally it's also a bit about finance support that can lead to action and support, how this can play a role. Let's look a little bit like how does this relate to current actions being taken? If you look into risk layering in the European Union, we find those layers here. Also, we find those visualized here. Of course, taking more like a risk finance or insurance logic at the heart of it, which is not the only lens to that. But we see indeed risk reduction doesn't pop up, but here the first layer starts with insurance, then reinsurers take it up. But there's no perfect level of insurance and reinsurance. So governments come in and support where, private insurance is not feasible or not cost effective and people cannot afford it. In the EU, over the years, we have seen that these three layers don't suffice, and also the European Union has become a solidarity pool. After large-scale flooding in Central Europe, here we see Prague, and an oil spill like off the coast of Spain in 2002, the European Solidarity Fund was put up, and this provides additional funding to European Union member countries after events to help them recover and rebuild. In the wake of the COVID pandemic, now this IIASF, the Euro Solidarity Fund, has been extended to also now cover major public health emergencies. So that's really interesting. Now we got another big catastrophic existential risk sitting in that pool. So one could argue the European Union is taking action on that. It's not perfect, the action, because the IIASF, the Solidarity Fund, is quite small, covers a few hundred millions, but it's a line of action that has been taken forward. Simple thinking is, could that also be taken forward globally to deal with like climate-driven existential risks? And we would probably say, yes, can be done, because we are seeing at national and regional levels, we are seeing risk pools being taken forward globally, for example, in the Caribbean, in Africa, the Philippines, but also in certain exposed countries. Such risk pools being taken forward to provide support to governments that are losing infrastructure, but also to farmers in Africa that are facing drought. So those pools have been put into place, and they have always been supported by donor support and ODA spending. So we got a sense of solidarity in those pools already, and the international institutions like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and Caribbean Development Bank, and African Development Banks, sorry for listing those, they have been quite active. But what still needs to be done is a bit more the high-risk layer needs further attention. Yeah, that's a busy chart. Here's like a way to calculate risk. And here we see a global map where we see what a 100-year event would mean to public coffers across the globe. So what would be the losses in a 100-year event? But what would be the losses that cannot be absorbed by countries globally? And we see in the global south, some of these marked in red, some of these countries listed here. And so that suggests here's an issue of like risk going beyond adaptation potentials, according to that modeling that we are doing at IIASA. So this is more like the formalized or monetized risk, but what's also needs further consideration is more the intangible part of risk. And that's, I mentioned that because that's intuitive, but that's also a very important part of the loss and damage debate. It's not about losing infrastructure and structures, cars, homes. Of course, it is about this, but it's also a lot about things that can hardly be valued, so intangible losses and damages. Here's a busy chart from colleague Chuckert and other colleagues in Australia, showing also like it's about culture, lifestyle, physical health, mental, emotional well-being, and sense of place. So really intangible things that are very, very dear to us beyond the monetary value. So they're not as much considered. Of course, that's hard to put into those pools, but they are piece and parcel also of the debate on loss and damage. Okay, I wanted to proceed. Now my computer is stuck. Okay, there it is. Okay. 1 second. Sorry, I wanted to go here. What I wanted to say, so that's a bit like there's risk pools, there's risk management actions. What would be principles for action support on those things? Let me list those quickly. One is solidarity, so that we are seeing acted upon. We are doing that, also the international community is doing that. It's based on the concept of voluntary transfers. Then the risk pools I mentioned, they have mutuality added. So here's a risk pool, there's those affected in a risk pool, and they are jointly sharing risk. The interesting part is now accountability. So that comes in with climate change. Here one can talk about perceived ethical or legal obligations for climate attributable losses and damages. So the suggestion is here to escalate the debate a little bit from solidarity to mutuality to accountability. And we're seeing that already a little bit. Bangladesh and Philippines, they have pools. This is national solidarity. And we got those pools I've just shown. Caribbean pool, we got international solidarity in the mix. If we jump forward to like the African pool, they also got a certain climate facility where triggers linked to climate changes in climate and weather would come into effect. So there's also the issue of accountability in there. So if climate and weather can be attributed to anthropogenic climate change, we can here talk about accountability, and the international community may service these additional demands that are driven by changes in climate. I talk about the last one here. Also, there's in Scotland at COP26, there was action on that. So that's about accountability and attributability. It's not the same. Attributable means impacts are linked to anthropogenic climate change. And that can be done today. Science has moved forward on that. It can be well done on physical and biological systems. In human systems, it's still a bit complicated because also here we have exposure and vulnerability. So decisions by people in the mix, and that's a bit more complicated to think about. So the perfect link, accountability, attributable, seems not possible currently, but it can be acted upon. Quick one here. Also, people have taken it to the courts. There's this farmer from Peru that has sued the German utility RWE for their contribution to the chance of a glacial lake outburst flood that may impact him, who lives downstream of that, of that lake in the Cordillera Blanca in Peru. With the support of the NGO German Watch, he has taken RWE to the court, not for ask for compensation what has been lost, but for support to avoid that this lake will break, this glacial lake outburst flood will happen. So basically he wants support that there can be like a dam can be strengthened here. So there's no glacial lake outburst flood. That has been in the mix for 5 years, but it's been taken forward to the courts. And the idea here is, to also see about how glacial melt increases the lake, the size of the lake, and leads to a higher chance of that lake bursting. So I'm running a bit later here, but I wanted to come up with some takeaways from COP26. So what's happening on this issue about emergency crisis, but also existential risk? Let me just move quickly forward here. In Glasgow and in the Glasgow Climate Pact, it didn't lead to the emergency pact, as some countries are suggesting. Science is mentioned first and foremost in the first chapter. And the urgency, the alarming urgency and concern expressed by negotiating parties, so these are 194 countries across the globe, are totally linked to the science. So science is listened to, again, one could say. We move to the next one. It's a bit slow here. Slide system is slow. The next slide was supposed to talk about the 1.5 target. That's also coming from climate change. So the 1.5 target that I mentioned earlier on, that came out of the Paris Agreement, was also like mentioned throughout the negotiations, but also in the corridors of the negotiations. Now I lost my slides, however. I need to see, so please bear with me for 1 second. I now lost this, it's not moving. Okay. Sorry for that. So that's another emergency here, sorry for that. It's not responding. I need to, unfortunately, need to come back to, well, there it is. Okay. Okay, that is, I lost it. Sorry, I need to put that up. It's not so great. Please stop sharing. Let me just keep talking. So Glasgow was very relevant and interesting. And science was really like mentioned in the first chapter. And then there was a lot of talk about the 1.5 degree target, whether that's feasible and what actions to be taken about this. Finally, in this Glasgow Pact that I mentioned, it is mentioned prominently, and the 1.5 degrees mentioned prominently, and also this issue about phasing out the fossils were mentioned prominently. But the key question is, of course, how achievable would that be still? And as we know, we are currently at 1.1 degrees of warming. And 1.5 is not that distant anymore. So it's really, really complicated, really tough to get to that limit, not to go beyond that limit. But of course, that's, great. Okay, let's use those. Thanks, okay. So colleague Marie is having it. Okay, Marie, then, okay, let's use this one. Thanks, let's move on. So that's basically on the mitigation side. So if you want to avoid existential risk, it will be important to stick to the 1.5 degree target. It's complicated. It's not within reach. More needs to be done. So let's move on. Thanks, Marie. And to the next one. Yeah, we can also go beyond that. Loss and damage. Yeah, loss and damage was in the corridors because exactly we see losses and damages proliferating globally and really impacting communities across the globe. There was some first commitments done by, as I mentioned, the Global North that has been hesitant to provide specific funding for loss and damage. Here now the First Minister of Scotland and also the region of Wallonia in Belgium, they pledged support in the millions, as well as some philanthropists globally. But there was a call by 140 global southern countries from the global south for like a loss and damage facility that would really pick up millions or billions that could support action on loss and damage. That was not picked up in the final compact and the Glasgow Pact. However, a decision was made that there's a technical hub will be set up called the Santiago Network. What's probably interesting is some are suggesting, some media are suggesting that Scotland, so the First Minister of Scotland, broke a loss and damage taboo by providing finance for this facility or this loss and damage fund. I'm not going to argue it's about compensation, but I would say it's probably about being accountable to what's needed in the global south to deal with existential risk. And that you see in that little session here, that's the First Minister speaking up in a session that we were like co-running with colleagues from NGO partners. If you move to the next one, please. Yeah, maybe a quick one, just impressions and how does this existential crisis talk? What happened after COP? Taking a positive spin on it by job description, Antonio Guterres was saying, well, it's not enough. It's time to go into emergency mode, but the climate battle is ongoing. Greta Thunberg has a different job description, and she was just saying this tweet on this media piece here, still on the road to hell, right? So that's like a summary. NGO partners were clearly very unhappy about the fact that not further action on loss and damage had happened at COP. And they see it more like a clear betrayal of the millions of people suffering from the climate crisis. So they were also unhappy. Everybody was unhappy. And I guess also the recollection or the summary is that more should have been done. But the climate summit brought 194 countries together to discuss really contested and tough issues. So maybe that's a success that we have discussions like that. The outcome is not a massive success. If you move to the next one, please. Quick, I wanted to probably end with that saying, given the scope of the issues, existential risk, but also the international discussion on loss and damage, if you move to the next one, science should think about providing evidence, but also it should think about providing, like working with action, and that could be practice and could also be policy. Quick promotion here. We are working with a Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance that brings NGO partners together with also the private sector to work in many frontline communities across the globe. We are active in more than 250 communities. If you go to the next one, to think about different actions, so we can go to the next to last one, to think about standard actions and transformation. So really transforming the way we're dealing with disaster risk and climate-related risk. So that can mean for like India, it could mean just creating enabling environments, so really pushing ahead with climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. It could also mean for Nepal and Myanmar to tackle the underlying root causes and systemic issues that are providing barriers for true action on climate change. Also, we are looking into like developed countries and so on. Brings me to the very last slide. I think, yeah, finally, quick comments in this lengthy presentation. So I would say climate-related risks increasingly considered existential. There is a space for international policy actions, and we are trying to inform that space. And here it's about climate justice and equitable support for current impacts, but also future risks. A climate risk analytical lens doesn't lead all the way, but I think it provides an interesting entry point that may help to find common ground for parties from the global north and the global south. Yeah, we need to do more to provide robust evidence, and I think it's totally necessary to proceed with science policy practice partnerships that can inform global policy, but also inform local practice in order to tackle those increasing the existential risks that are linked to climate change. And that's it from my end. So thanks for the attention. Sorry for the hiccup. Thanks for my colleague taking over, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Reinhard, for the presentation and insights into these topics. We're now opening up the event to Q&A. So please share your questions in the Q&A box found on Zoom. But to get us started, Reinhard, I have a question. I think I've known you many years at IIASA, and I'm curious about what brought you into this work and what you enjoy most about it.
Yeah, I enjoy most of it, of course, the busy slide sets that I'm showing. So colleagues know that. Yeah, no, honestly, so I originally, I'm trained as an economist, but I also studied a bit like mathematics and also literature and so different things. But I would call myself maybe an ecological economist. So I worked quite a bit. I was quite interested in my studies, and after those studies, in the climate mitigation elements. So how to reduce emissions and take actions on those. Then somehow, by chance, I ended up in a PhD program on natural or unnatural disasters. And that has since really been exciting for me. So this question about what are the impacts of disasters, what can be done about it, what's the role for local action, what's the role for global action. And I've worked a bit across the globe, and IIASA has been a great place to do so. Climate change has come in over the last 10 years. And here, now I'm coming a little bit full circle now, coming back a little bit also to that question, how is this linked to mitigation and reducing the emissions? So yeah, but basically I would call myself more like a risk analyst or risk scientist that tries to understand risk better, risk that's linked to disasters, climate, but now it's also been COVID issues. So that's a bit where I'm coming from, and yeah, there's much more to be done. It's exciting times, but it's also like a bit depressing times, right? So we seem to be facing a number of crises that needs attention by all of us. Thanks, Monica.
Yeah, no, thanks, Reinhard. That I think goes into one of the other questions that have come up on why is it so difficult to get countries to pick up the bill for loss and damage?
Yeah, why is it difficult to build up action on loss and damage? Yeah.
Sorry, for countries to pick up the bill.
Pick up the bill, so obviously, because as I mentioned, as I alluded to in the beginning, the notion of compensation, has interesting, of course, meaning for developed countries. So it's about big polluters from the global north supposed to compensate countries in the global south, right? So it's all about north-south compensation. And the fear by some of these global polluters, and I'm from one of those, of course, Germany, but there's others, fear of some of these countries is that the bills will be massive, right? It could be in the trillions and the billions. It's not a good excuse, I think, but it's, of course, it's like also an understandable excuse. So that's one concern. Can we service those bills? The other concern is a little bit what happens with the money. What purpose can it be put to? Like, if you compensate, what could happen with that? So that's the second one. And there's a third one also that's a bit linked to litigation, right? If you start compensating, then also this can also be taken to courts, and the bill can be even more massive. So I think it's all understandable concerns, but it's also understandable that the global south asks for some kind of justice. Not every disaster is climate change, but we have seen it that many disasters are indeed driven now by increasingly so by climate change. So there's a certain portion to that. And some slow onset events like drought or salinization, there's a strong signal in there, or heat, very strong signal. So I think, this general climate justice issue is well understood. I think this you also get from countries in the south and the north, you totally get it. But if the issue is about compensation, liability, and litigation, then the dialogue becomes very complicated. And we're trying to somehow be in the middle of it, trying to see about, can these worlds not be connected? Because indeed there's awareness that climate change is upon us in the north and the south, and some countries are less equipped to deal with that, and are really, in those places, it really pushes communities and people to the brink and to their existential limits. Long answer to the key question, yeah.
Yeah, no, but thanks, Reinhard. And one of our participants, Holger Hoff, asks us a very interesting question about including stakeholders. So do you have any examples, best practices of science policy society partnerships in your field?
Oh yeah, that's an easy question. Thanks, Holger. So yeah, well, I think at IIASA, but also other places, there's a well-developed line of work of co-generating insight, let's say, on risks, but also on risk management actions. So I think the key trick is to involve those that are potentially at risk or have been affected in the past, involve them from the beginning in your endeavors. So ask the questions, what are the key issues? And what's your knowledge, and what's the local knowledge that can be built upon, and then be integrated with global or regional level insight. And this can be done by just checking in, but it can also be done by more elaborate stakeholder exercises. Can also be gameful. There's this issue of serious gaming. It can be done quite interactively, so to really engage people. And I think that's good practice across the globe now, and of course also led by the Global South. Because I should say, I talked a little bit about North versus South, and versus those that need to pay and those that are being affected. But of course, that's not the full story. I've also done quite some work in Nepal or Bangladesh, and here's a lot of capacity available locally, and here people are really leading the way from those communities. So there's a lot of knowledge available, and that can really lead to actionable insight. And I think over the last 10 to 15 years, this has been understood. We need the global modeling integrated with local insight. And that sounds easy, but also still takes time and support.
Thanks, Reinhard. So a follow-up on this, we have how can economic studies help risk reduction?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say maybe replace economic by socioeconomic. Then I would say it can help quite a bit, right? So, of course, the existential is linked a lot to socioeconomics. And finally, we want to understand what are the potential impacts in social systems. So, like in our own lives, in our own communities and countries, you want to understand what the socioeconomic impacts are. In addition, of course, to the ecological impacts. So, some sense of like understanding impacts and risks is important. Then, of course, the thing is there's no zero risk, and that's linked to decision making, right? So, and I would say decision making is importantly informed by socioeconomics. So, what do we value? How much are we willing to give up or like invest in order to safeguard these values or create risks? And I think this has to do a lot with socioeconomic analysis. I'm not opting for like rigorous cost-benefit analysis, but it's certainly about decision-making and ambitions, values, trade-offs, and how they are being serviced. And so I think if we interpret economic studies or socioeconomic studies as this and leading into decision-making, I think it can help a lot. And it's really very decisive for understanding risk reduction and risk management.
Thanks, Reinhard. We have Katharina Bailey is wondering about buffering mechanisms such as insurance or government funds. Do you think these might reduce perceived urgency to do something about the root cause of the problem? What do you think about this dynamic?
Oh yeah, the disincentives, right? It's this logic, if there's money set aside or if we're insured, we give up risk reduction action. Yeah, that's indeed an issue, but I would say those, as are positively promoted, these regional pools or these national regional pools, they're not massive, right? So they're not massively capitalized, so more needs to be done about those. And then you can also like link, you can think about also providing incentives for risk reduction. I don't want to talk about insurance too much here, but if you have, for example, if you have car insurance, you usually don't get full insurance. So the first 1,000 euros you have to pay yourself if you have an accident. Something like this or can also be built in, or you can get additional benefits depending on the actions you take as an individual, as a community, or a country. So there's certain mechanisms in place that you can go against this, as it's called, moral hazard. The fact that you're insured and that you give up action after you're insured. So there's certain actions, none of these are perfect. It's complicated, but I think it needs attention. It can be somewhat built in, and it's also some field that's further being studied.
Okay. Thanks. And so our next question comes from an anonymous attendee who's wondering how we can create robust insights on limits to adaptation.
Robust, yeah. Question is what robust is. I would say it's about high confidence. It's a bit how our colleagues, that's how we do it in the IPCC. So we talk about low, medium, high confidence. So that high confidence means there's good literature and the literature agrees. So the papers, the peer-reviewed papers or the gray literature produced, there's quite a bit of literature available and the literature agrees to what's coming out. And that would be high confidence. The next level would be medium confidence. So I think it would be important to appeal to that level, to medium to high confidence. So that's usually then leading also to action in the halls of climate negotiations, as I just alluded to. So the IPCC is being listened to at the climate summits. If you have stuff that has medium to high confidence, it goes into the summaries of our big reports. Summaries are being read, the big reports, I don't know, this is a lot of pages. So I think we need to aspire a bit to medium to high confidence. Currently we have this, but more for the natural systems. So for coral reefs, and then also like, for other ecosystems, we had quite some high confidence that climate change is pushing those systems to the hard limits. So that's available, and that will also probably come out later next year. And the social system is more complicated. I would say it's more like low to medium. So more needs to be done. And we need this mixed exercises, these mixed methods exercises, risk analysis, coupled also with stakeholder interaction. And there was also a question like, to what extent do we do quantitative risk analysis? So exactly, that's also what we do at IIASA. It needs to be quantitative and qualitative. So we need these mixed exercises. More studies in those places where it makes a difference, right? In the frontline communities. And that's still not available and it's quite often not being done because it needs a bit of support globally. So more studies, I would say more studies and more interaction with like researchers plus practitioners.
Okay. Thanks, Reinhard. Another anonymous question that came in climate science, there has been much talk about tipping points of natural systems. Do you also see that there might be some social tipping points that can become transformational moments for more ambitious climate action, or also for a reversal of climate action?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's a good question. Because indeed, the work I presented on existential risk goes into the negative tipping points or the negative adaptation tipping points. So that's more the adaptation side of things. So risk becomes massive, then it tips the system, and that's the end of the story. So there's no positive side to it. That's almost a suggestion here. That's not, and that's a bit different from the mitigation side where we talk about positive tipping points. So all of a sudden, everyone driving an electrical vehicle that's ideally powered by green energy, right? From one day to the other, there's positive tipping points. People pick that up, and we go to like a net zero society. So that's the spin. That's the narrative on the mitigation side. On the adaptation side, we don't have it as much, and for good reasons, because I think it's important to think about this existential risk. But it is also important to think about the positive that can come out from adaptation. For example, like green roofs, so in cities, making cities more heat resilient or absorptive of like fluvial flooding. So there can also be positive societal benefits. So some of these positive tipping points you can also think about, and indeed they have been found. At the same time, we got, of course, these massive events happening that I mentioned before. So this should not be lost sight of, that it's a lot about avoiding these negative tipping points as adaptation limits. But this is a good question indeed. It's not about doomsday. It is about doomsday, of course, but it's also about the other side of the coin, because that also incentivizes action.
Okay, thanks, Reinhard. We had another question now come in about the implication of risks from the private sector. So could you please shed light on the implication for companies, their risks being covered by risk transfer mechanisms, being held accountable, for example, by their own governments as a consequence of international risk transfer?
Oh yeah, that's a complicated question. So that probably could go. So that's a question about risks on the balance sheet, right? So there's probably one or two takes into that question. One thing is that companies indeed are also looking into their balance sheets, what's sitting in their balance sheets, and how is this impacted by climate impacts. So it's called the physical risk. So I think companies all over the globe are doing this now. There's a whole industry is developing that supports the private sector in doing that and being better braced so that they don't face their existential limits, right? So they're somehow, they have taken that up also in response to IPCC and other reports. So that's totally happening. The other one is, of course, then the more complicated one. It's a transition risk. So companies now in their balance sheets, not only like having this physical risk, holding those physical risks, but also holding transition risks. So like investments into coal industry or like fossil fuel powered business. So that would be more the indirect link here, like companies and their stakeholders like needing to deal with that fact that actions by companies or investments also leading to further emissions, to further global warming. So that's more the indirect link. And I think also we see the action on this one. So the one is more the transition risk, the other one is the physical risk. So both are being considered. It has become now the gold standard, I think, for big business, but also smaller business globally. And that makes sense, and there's capacity there, I think, for doing so. Also at COP, at the Climate Summit, we saw that also here. That's an opportunity for business, but it's also something that's important, right? I'm not suggesting the same should be done for communities or countries globally, but the logic is a bit similar, right? Better understand what are the risks, what actions can be taken, but also how does international solidarity, but also accountability come in. So there is some corollaries and some entry points from private into public sector actions. But it would be probably a bit more of a complicated story, and that's a good question. So I'll think about this further. Thanks. From the anonymous colleagues, yeah.
No, thanks, Reinhard. And I think we have time for this last question, and then maybe at the end we'll just ask for any insights that you would like to leave us with. But before that, we had a question come in on what is your opinion on the future of loss and damage debate? How do you see how it may take shape in COP27, especially your views on the North-South dynamics and understandings?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we go from one COP to the other, but also in between lots is happening. And I think there was quite some dynamic at this climate summit to lead into like a facility, like another fund that would provide support, sorry, for countries that are being impacted by climate change. So there was like, yeah, that was put in the final compact. It was taken out, but I think there's some dynamics here. So I would see some further development happening. The question would probably be a little bit about like language, rhetoric. Is it like, if it's called compensation, if it's called litigation and stuff. So this may be tough to convince the global north. If you call it something else, and if you just build on those risk pools that I mentioned, this could go a long way. Because face it, like if I look back to Germany, Germany has a reserve fund. We call it a catastrophe fund or reserve fund. 40 billion have been put together to help people that were affected by our massive flooding this summer. They have been compensated for, and here compensation is the word to be used. So in Germany, we got those funds, there's money available. It's not endless, but it's available. My simple thinking would be, why not support also action in the global south along these lines? And there's these pools to build on. I would probably say attribution, litigation, probably complicated words, compensation, but why not call it accountability? Because that shows it's not only about action, but it's also like taking this to heart and really acting on it. So I think I would see there's something would need to happen, will happen, I guess. Let's see where it's taking us now and next year. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Reinhard. And I think that brings us to the closing of our webinar. I'd like to thank you very much and everybody for joining us today. A video of the webinar will be available on the IIASA website and YouTube channel. We'll also share the links that have been mentioned in the talk. I hope you've learned and discovered about risk and resilience today. We count on your opinion to improve our future events. So please answer the survey that will pop up in the browser after leaving the meeting. We hope to see you at our next IIASA webinar on the 26th of January, 2022. And follow us on social media for updates. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.